Hello, Harry Horton here, political correspondent with ITV News. And for this episode of Talking Politics, we're in Johannesburg in South Africa for the G20 summit, where the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is meeting world leaders. I spoke to him for Talking Politics, and in my interview I asked him about the challenges that Labour face from...
Starmer pleads for government to unite in fight back after difficult week. Keir Starmer has warned senior ministers and officials to stop briefing against one another and leaking details of the budget as he pleaded for his embattled government to unite. The Prime Minister told his weekly cabinet meeting that last week's political turmoil had distracted from voters' priorities, and ministers needed to work together and start delivering rather than talking about the government itself. His warning came after a turbulent week during which his government was engulfed by accusations of briefing against the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, and reports of a major pre-budget U-turn. The Prime Minister's spokesperson said on Tuesday, he said distractions meant our focus shifted from where it mattered most, working every day in the service of the British people. The Prime Minister said next week's budget would prioritise rebuilding the economy, showing what the government stands for. He said people were rightly impatient for change, and we had to deliver that rather than talk about ourselves. That meant working as one team, delivering opportunity and security and delivering on our mandate. The comments form the second part of a fightback by Starmer after one of the most difficult weeks of his premiership, which was consumed by stories about infighting and budget leaks rather than NHS changes and new rights for renters. The first part came on Tuesday morning, when the Mirror published an interview with the Prime Minister in which he promised to fight the next election as Labour leader, despite growing speculation about his political future. He told the newspaper, "Let me be really clear, every minute that's not spent talking about and dealing with the cost of living is a minute wasted of the political work of this government." The Prime Minister insisted Number 10 had not been behind the briefings, which were widely seen as an attempt to put Streeting on the back foot. In the end, Streeting gave an assured round of interviews on Wednesday in which he backed Starmer but also burnished his own leadership credentials by dealing with the rumours with a relaxed humour. Just as talk about Starmer's position was dying down, Downing Street and the Treasury were rocked by stories on Thursday night revealing that he and the Chancellor had decided not to raise income taxes as previously planned. Officials had been drawing up plans for weeks for a controversial rise in income tax rates, despite Labour having promised in its manifesto not to do so. On Wednesday, Starmer and Reeves decided not to pursue this course, choosing instead to raise a number of smaller taxes in an approach some have called a smorgasbord. They had hoped to communicate that in a gradual way over the week before the budget but were blindsided by a story in the Financial Times revealing the decision on Thursday. Starmer's allies hope his promise to remain in place into the next election will dampen speculation over potential successors. However, with Labour on 19% in the polls, 8 points behind Reform UK, many in his party think he could face a contest after the local elections in May. Show more. Starmer's battle for control, inside the week that shook Westminster. The cracks are showing. And when the Prime Minister has to stand up in front of his own cabinet and tell them to stop knifing each other in the back, you know things have gone spectacularly wrong. Keir Starmer, the man who promised stability, competence, and an end to the chaos of the Conservative years, has just endured what might be the worst week of his premiership. And here's the thing that should terrify Labour MPs up and down the country: we're not even a year into this government. Before we dive into the carnage, if you want to stay ahead of the Westminster power plays and understand what's really happening behind those number 10 doors, hit that subscribe button now. This is Current UK, and we're bringing you the political analysis that cuts through the spin. So let's set the scene. It's Tuesday morning, and the Prime Minister walks into his weekly cabinet meeting not with a confident stride but with what we can only imagine was a rather terse expression. Because what Starmer had to say wasn't about policy victories or economic triumphs. No, he had to tell his senior ministers and officials to stop behaving like squabbling children at a birthday party who've had too much sugar. Stop briefing against each other. Stop leaking budget details to friendly journalists. Stop talking about yourselves and start actually governing. The words of a man in control? Hardly. These are the words of someone watching his government implode in real time, and desperately trying to hold it together with sellotape and stern warnings. His spokesperson delivered the message with all the diplomatic polish you'd expect. The Prime Minister said distractions meant their focus shifted from where it mattered most, working in the service of the British people. Translation: you lot are making us look like amateurs, and the public is noticing. Starmer apparently told them that next week's budget would show what the government stands for, that people were rightly impatient for change, and that ministers needed to deliver rather than talk about themselves. Which is rather ironic when you consider that this entire mess was caused by ministers and officials doing exactly that, talking about themselves, briefing against colleagues, and turning what should be a united government into something resembling a particularly vicious episode of the thick of it. Now, if you're finding this breakdown of Westminster's latest meltdown valuable, do us a favor and tap that like button. It helps us continue bringing you this level of detailed political coverage. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. This cabinet tongue-lashing wasn't just about general bad behavior. It came after a week that can only be described as catastrophic for Starmer's carefully cultivated image. We had accusations that Number 10 was briefing against Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary. We had reports of a major budget U-turn that wasn't supposed to be public knowledge yet. And we had the Mirror publishing an interview with Starmer where he felt compelled to promise he'd fight the next election as Labour leader. Think about that for a moment. The Prime Minister, with a massive parliamentary majority, barely months into his term, having to publicly insist that yes, he does intend to lead his party into the next election. That's not a sign of strength. That's a man firefighting speculation about his political mortality. And the speculation isn't coming from nowhere, is it? When you're polling at 19%, 8 points behind Reform UK, a party that didn't even exist in its current form a few years ago, you're in existential territory. This isn't just bad. This is catastrophically bad. The kind of numbers that make backbench MPs start doing mathematics about their own seats and wondering if perhaps a change at the top might be their only hope of survival come the next election. Let's talk about the Wes Streeting situation because it's absolutely delicious in its toxicity. Downing Street, according to multiple reports, was behind briefings that appeared designed to undermine Streeting. Why? Well, Streeting has been one of the few Labour ministers who's actually cut through to the public. He's articulate, he doesn't speak in the robotic talking points that make political interviews utterly unwatchable, and crucially, he's been willing to say controversial things about NHS reform that need saying. That makes him dangerous if you're a Prime Minister whose own public performances have all the charisma of a damp towel. And here's the beautiful irony: when Streeting did his round of interviews on Wednesday, he handled the whole thing with relaxed humour and assured confidence, actually managing to look more leadership-ready than the man who's supposed to be leading. He backed Starmer, of course, but in doing so, he reminded everyone watching exactly why some people think he might be a better option. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the chaos, why not share this video with anyone who wants to understand what's really going on in British politics? Hit that share button and spread the word about current UK. Now, just when you thought the week couldn't get worse for Starmer, along comes Thursday night and the budget leak that has sent shockwaves through Westminster. Officials had been quietly drawing up plans for weeks for a controversial rise in income tax rates. Let that sink in. This is a Labour government that explicitly promised in its manifesto not to raise income tax. They won an election on that promise, among others. And then they started planning to break it. The sheer political stupidity of even considering this is breathtaking. Did no one in Number 10 remember what happened to parties that break tax promises? Has no one there ever heard of Nick Clegg and tuition fees? But here's where it gets even more farcical. On Wednesday, Starmer and Rachel Reeves, his Chancellor, decided not to pursue the income tax rise after all. Good decision, you might think. Except they'd spent weeks working on it. Weeks of civil service time, weeks of political capital being quietly spent, weeks of potential for this secret to leak out. And then they changed their minds. They decided instead to go for what's being called a smorgasbord approach, raising a number of smaller taxes rather than one big controversial one. Classic political fudge, really. Death by 1,000 cuts rather than one clean strike. The plan was to communicate this change gradually over the week before the budget, managing the narrative, controlling the message, doing all those things that competent governments are supposed to do. And then the Financial Times published the story on Thursday night, blowing the whole thing wide open. Someone leaked it. Someone inside either Number 10 or the Treasury decided that their relationship with a Financial Times journalist was more important than collective cabinet responsibility or basic government discipline. And that's the leak that prompted Starmer's cabinet room lecture about working as one team. The thing is, when you have to tell senior ministers to work as one team, you've already lost. Proper teams don't need to be told that. Functional governments don't have prime ministers standing up and pleading with their own cabinet to stop stabbing each other and leaking to the press. This is the behavior of a government in crisis, a government where different factions are already positioning for what comes next, where officials and special advisors are cultivating relationships with journalists because they know their current bosses might not be around much longer. Starmer's spokesperson insisted that Number 10 wasn't behind the streeting briefings. And you know what? They might even be telling the truth. But that almost makes it worse. Because if Number 10 isn't in control of the briefing operation, if they're not the ones managing the media narrative, then who is? Are we looking at a government where different power centers are operating independently, each with their own media strategy, each trying to shape coverage in their favor? That's not a government. That's a civil war being conducted through newspapers and broadcast media. The Mirror interview is particularly telling. Starmer promised to fight the next election as Labour leader, saying every minute not spent talking about the cost of living is a minute wasted. Which is absolutely correct, except his government is the one wasting those minutes. They're the ones creating the stories about infighting. They're the ones leaking budget details. They're the ones generating speculation about leadership challenges. The call is coming from inside the House. And here's the brutal political reality that Labour MPs are starting to confront. The local elections are in May. That's not far away. If those go badly, and with these polling numbers they very well might, then Starmer will face questions about his leadership that won't be dampened by assurances to the Mirror. Backbenchers who've watched their vote share collapse, councillors who've lost their seats, local party members who've been out campaigning and getting doors slammed in their faces, they're not going to be placated by promises to unite and deliver. They're going to want results, or they're going to want change. What we're witnessing is a government that's lost control of its narrative before it even had a chance to establish one. They won a massive majority, yes, but that was more about Conservative collapse than Labour enthusiasm. And now, without the unifying force of being in opposition, without the simple message of we're not them, Labour is discovering that governing is actually rather difficult, especially when your team seems more interested in briefing against each other than in running the country. The budget next week is being positioned as a reset moment, a chance to show what this government stands for. But budgets don't fix broken governments. They can provide temporary relief, a few days of talking about policy rather than personality. But the underlying problems remain. The polling remains catastrophic. The internal divisions remain. The lack of a clear, compelling vision that the public can understand and support remains. And Reform UK remains 8 points ahead, ready to hoover up every disaffected Labour voter and turn Starmer's majority into a minority at the next election. This is the week that might well be remembered as the beginning of the end for Keir Starmer's premiership. Not because of any single catastrophic event, but because it revealed the fundamental weakness at the heart of this government. They can't control their own message. They can't keep their own secrets. They can't stop their own people from briefing against each other. And if you can't do those basic things, how are you supposed to run a country? The political temperature in Westminster has shifted. You can feel it in the way MPs talk in the tea rooms, in the knowing looks between journalists who've been on the receiving end of briefings, in the careful language being used by ministers who know their words will be parsed for any hint of disloyalty or leadership ambition. This is what the beginning of political mortality looks like. And Starmer knows it, which is why he's standing in cabinet pleading for unity, giving interviews promising to lead at the next election, trying to steady a ship that's already listing badly. The tragedy is that Britain actually needs a competent government. The challenges facing the country haven't gone away just because we've changed the party in charge. But competence requires discipline, unity, and a clear sense of purpose. And right now, Labour has none of those things. So here we are. A government in crisis, a prime minister on the defensive, and a budget next week that had better be absolutely flawless because there's no more political capital left to waste. The stakes couldn't be higher. And if you want to stay on top of how this all unfolds, make sure you're subscribed to Current UK, because this story is far from over.